So friends, the first part of the discussion by Dr. Bajaj was about the general traits of the English essay that were given voice to and representation of by Boswell, and that he was a part and parcel of the sensibility of the 18th century, but then he was becoming individualistic through certain things that he was adopting for use in his representation, and that particular thing was the character that he created out of his own will, and that was called hypochondriac, and that this person would be a person who would be on the sides, not at the center of things, and from there he would look at the developments in the 18th century. So with this kind of background, I believe it becomes very easy now for us to see and observe the subtleties of the English essay in the hands of Boswell and the category to which he belongs in general. So over to you once again, Dr. Bajaj, and please tell us more about these things, particularly in the context of Boswell.
Yes. So Boswell's Hypochondriack is the series that he brought out, and this was published in the London magazine, as I mentioned in my previous essay lecture. That and here the hypochondriac actually he assuming an extreme form of the 18th century man of feeling. Right. So, in a way you can call it ironic. It might appear in that sense, ironic to the 18th century, but not so to the 19th century. So, the hypochondriac then, through that, Boswell actually projected in his essay the temperament of a person who's, for instance, suffering from melancholy and gloom. And this was a common thing, because he says that there are many people like me who would be feeling and going through a similar sort of a feeling. And like Johnson before him and Mackenzie after him, Boswell actually immersed his periodical persona in a well of introspection. As you can notice that introspection is gaining center space in a lot of these essay writing that is happening towards the close of the 18th century. And just as the essay in the initial phase looked outward towards the public, towards the public spaces, right, or people, now you have the essay which is moving inward or turning into a kind of introspective space. Right. For instance, I will take you to immediately to the hypochondriac itself, and this is where Boswell is defining what the hypochondriac would mean, or what is this essay all about. He tells us that, and I quote, there are multitude of things that confounds and overwhelms the mind of a hypochondriac. His opinion of himself is low and desponding. His temporary dejection makes his faculties seem quite feeble. He imagines that everybody thinks meanly of him, unquote. So, in the essay itself, he is defining what a hypochondriac means, or who a hypochondriac is, as he goes forward to discuss. So, what I am trying to suggest here is that in this particular essay, he is telling you about the character of the hypochondriac, right, or delineating the aspects, the mode of thinking, the processes, the mental processes of this character. And then further on he goes on to talk about, this hypochondriac goes on to talk about various aspects of life. So first, just as you in a novel you build a kind of a realistic setting and then make characters move, here in this case you build the character realistically and then use this person's eye as the lens through which you are going to look at life. Does it make sense to you?
Yes, absolutely. This is very creative that you are presenting it, that first you create the person and then you start looking at the sensibility and the different factors that operate there.
And immediately what you've done is you've made it into a realistic person, but at the same time you've made the reader aware that this is not a normal, objective, omniscient character. This is a hypochondriac through whose eyes you are going to look at life. Right?
So the two characters are the author and the character are completely separate. They are independent.
Or independent, or I mean that is a subject of debate whether they are one and the same or they are different. And yet so hypochondriac here is the narrator in that sense, right? And who tells us what he thinks of life. So you know that this vision is going to be colored, and yet at the same time it is so realistic that it is reliable. So, there is a kind of a dialectic operating there, that it is reliable because it is very realistic, but at the same time it is colored and prejudiced because it is a particular type that you are looking at.
And this would emerge as a strong force in the latter half of the 19th century, when people like Conrad, will start writing, and they assume a different persona in every novel.
Like I feel that like Dickens' Pickwick Papers, etc., pick up these aspects and then take this forward.
And Dickens is that great art of characterization. That has a lot to borrow from
all these writers,
insights,
and especially Boswell and others. So you can see that how he talks about the hypochondriac as somebody who has multitude of things that confound him and overwhelm him, and he has a very low opinion of himself, and he's very desponding. There is a temporary dejection that makes his faculties seem very feeble, and he imagines that everybody thinks meanly of him. So this is a person who's self-conscious, this is a person who's probably, anxious as well. So there is this anxious figure that he's creating for you. But then Boswell treats the reader, we've discussed so much about the personality of the persona who's talking. Let's also discuss how the writer projects the reader, or in fact the narrator or the persona looks at the reader. Now the hypochondriac actually looks at the reader as a confidant, as a friend, as somebody who he can open his heart to. So Boswell's hypochondriac actually wallowed in, rather than shying away from the fretfulness and the gloom and the despair that can torment a thinking being. And thinking being is an important point. He constantly says any thinking being is meant to be in torment. So it's like if you're a thinking being, then you are in torment and you're despairing and you're in gloom. So the periodical essayist actually prefer to address the reader as a confidant, and taking them into the private spaces of the study to consider human nature and the events in a very more relaxed manner. Right? So, you're entering somebody's study, you've entered somebody's bedroom, and you're having a private conversation, so again the mode has moved from the public to the private. Now, Boswell begins his piece on hypochondria number 39, that's the title of one of the pieces. He says that the hypochondriac, and I quote, is himself at this moment in a state of very dismal depression, so that he cannot be supposed capable of instructing or entertaining his readers. Right? So this is a kind of a disclaimer that he's already giving in the beginning. And then he says, I quote, but after keeping them company as a periodical essayist for 3 years, he considers them as his friends and trusts that they will treat him with a kindly indulgence.
Now just see the contours he is creating for the character to remain an independent category.
Right.
And all of us know that the writer is playing with the very structure of the character.
Right. Also playing with the reader's emotion or reader's, he's trying to hook the reader in by saying that I don't, but I can take liberty with you because I've been writing for 3 years and you've been reading my works for 3 years. So I consider the reader my friend. Of course, it's an unknown space, one doesn't know the reader. But he says that after keeping company as a periodical essayist for 3 years, he considers them as his friends and trusts that they will indulge him. Right? And he says certainly there is, you can see a sense of intimacy there and a trust that he's trying to build right in the beginning. And the writer is not self-conscious and he's fine with showing his readers, what he calls a wretched frame of mind. Right? So what I mean is that this wretched frame of mind is something which is so, a state of mind where he is in despair, agonized. He's okay, because he thinks that this voice is authentic and real.
And any reader who is going through the same thing would relate very closely with
and he
him.
says it, you just got it right on time. He says, he builds this confidence based on a mutually experienced state of mind. He says, and I quote, there may perhaps be some of my unhappy brethren just as ill as myself. Right? So, in a way, you feel that he's trying to connect with people who may be going through the same kind of despair, hopelessness, gloom, etc.
What is your guess? Is Boswell at that point of time also recognizing a large number of people who are as melancholic as he is.
I think so, yes. There is a sense of gloom, there is a sense of melancholy, which is what I realized because he says that I know a lot of people around me
Yes.
feel the same way. And so there is a sense of sadness or gloom that is there in Boswell's
So it makes
essays.
us wonder as to what was happening in the 18th century towards
Right.
the closing years.
And very interestingly, Boswell, I mean, he's a lawyer, diarist, etc. We don't see him as a very literary sort of figure, but he quotes so much from literature. He's constantly quoting from Shakespeare. For instance, in this context, he says in his, and he obviously takes these epigraphs, etc., from Latin phrases. So he's writing like all classical writers. But again, his essays actually read like soliloquies, because they just go on. He actually draws inspiration from Hamlet and quotes from Hamlet, and he says, and I quote, he says, everything appears to him quite indifferent. He repeats from Hamlet, how weary, stale, flat and unprofitable to me seem all the uses of this world.
Yes.
Right? So he's comparing his own state. He says that everything appears quite indifferent to him, and he repeats to himself the lines from Hamlet. So in fact, in that moment, I felt like it was almost Hamlet like this entire discourse.
And 16th century sensibility of the sense of the person is brought very very close to the atmosphere of the late 18th century.
Right. So I felt a sense of this introspective strain, very much like the soliloquies.
Crossing boundaries of time.
Right. Also soliloquies in Hamlet, they are like that, philosophical. And so these are very philosophical sort of I think.
And at the same time, the psychological dimension also is coming up.
So, yeah, absolutely. Because you're dealing with the mental strains.
Yes, yes.
So, he begins actually to believe the strange theory. He says that nothing exists without the mind, because he is sensible as he imagines of a total change in all the objects of his contemplation. What formerly had engaging qualities has them no more. The world is one undistinguished wild. Unquote. So the idea, as you said, there is psychological but also philosophical sense, because he says that he starts to believe that nothing exists without the mind. And as we know, this is the time when these theories are coming to the fore. That for instance, you will very soon be the Hegel's idea of the mind creating everything. So in a way, nothing exists without the mind is that kind of idealism or that sense of philosophical strain that he may be referring to. So I found that very interesting, that it is at once philosophical, literary, and at the same time just a freewheeling sort of an essay. So this is something that I thought was very interesting about this particular piece, or this number 39 on hypochondria. And again, melancholic and self-critical, the writer actually draws us into the mood of the times, that is beset with anxieties, and it is the thinking mind that is constantly beset with this kind of anxiety. And I'd like to take one more quote and maybe then take your response on it. He says, I quote, though his reason be entire enough, and he knows that his mind is sick, his gloomy imagination is so powerful that he cannot disentangle himself from its influence, unquote.
No, this is the kind of thing that would have come up in the latter half of the 18th century, where individuals, were thrown out of the system and they were on the margins. And some people were there from the villages, from the small towns, coming to London, and vice versa. And therefore, a different kind of a gloom was building up.
Right.
And this person would have taken note of it and put all these important details into the psychological frame of the character that he built.
Right. So there is a sense of corrosion that is occurring here, and I also feel that in a way all romantic writings stem from this kind of gloom vis-a-vis the present.
Yes,
so there is a sense of gloom or gloomy imagination that actually that gives rise to romantic.
That's the case with not Shelley, but definitely Blake and Coleridge, of all people.
Right.
He
absolutely. And these people wrote odes on melancholy.
Yes.
Right. So there is a sense of
Keats is there. Yes.
So all these people were, I think that they stem from this kind of gloomy imagination, and that's where you can see the mood of the time. And the essay actually ends with a hope that Boswell has or the hypochondriac hypochondriac actually has for fellow people who are suffering the same angst-ridden life and have, trying to find a way out of things,
So very 20th century.
Yeah,
in
very,
fact.
very 20th century, mid 20th
The
century.
century and between the two wars and starting from
Right.
the First World War.
Very existentialist in
Yes,
that sense.
absolutely,
Yeah.
yes.
So he says here, while writing this paper, I have by some gracious influence been insensibly relieved from the distress under which I labored when I began it. So, the therapeutic effect of writing itself, that, when I began, I was more distressed, but I have been cured of it. So, while writing this paper, I have by some gracious influence been insensibly relieved from the distress under which I labored when I began it.
So playing with religious faith also.
Yeah, he plays a lot. Like, in fact, this particular piece,
Gracious.
he constantly talks about how, religion might be the way, there is a kind of religious fear or religious, there's a complex relationship that he has with the religious angle. And then he says, may the same happy change be experienced by any of my readers in like affliction is my sincere prayer. And then he ends it with the note, the date, that is September 1780. So in a way, this is one of the specimens I thought that would make it interesting for us to analyze how the figure of the hypochondriac is being used to discuss the general gloom surrounding Europe and England at the time.
That becomes a general symbol of society at the time,
Right.
and of a large section of people. It's not the London merchant, it's not the rich person in England at that point of time, but the poor person, the middle class individual feeling, completely helpless and getting to the sides, and from there looking at things with gloom.
What I mean is, you can already see why and where from Wordsworth, for instance, would come up with something like the lyrical ballads or the preface to the lyrical ballads.
And still sad music of humanity.
Yeah, so you can already see that this is the base, this is what people have been feeling around the time, and this is what Boswell builds, the age, the feeling of the age, and the, if one could use such a phrase, that this is what defined that period, and Boswell does that really well, I think, in terms of telling us from the point of view of literary angle as well, that how the narrator also is changing, the writer itself is changing, because the category of the writer is no more this kind of figure on a pedestal or somebody who is moralizing, but rather somebody who is as afflicted as the reader. So there is a kind of an equal status of the writer that that Boswell's works somehow suggest, and they bring it closer to the life of the people, that I am as afflicted as you are. I'm as ill as you are, and I'm going through it. So the earlier writer was like, let me show you the way. I will tell you what's wrong with your life. I will teach you the right way of life.
This is the opposite of that.
So here the writer and the reader, they are both in the same boat, and they're both struggling to find an answer through exploration and other means. So I think that shift also is an important part of this exercise.
How do you interpret it as a kind of humanist endeavor, in the latter half of the 18th century? Because people are moving away from the middle class, surroundings and getting into the larger picture of pain and suffering.
No, I don't think they're moving away from the middle class. They're certainly moving away from the aristocratic class, and that life does not, and there is an awareness that life is outside and outside this circle as well, and literature is now moving away from the domain of aristocracy and entering the domain of common people. I think that is the larger shift that I see. The other thing through which that I see that there is a sense of humanism is the kind of dignity that is accorded to common people around, and their feelings. That is very important. What also all these writers are aware of, I think, whether we speak of Leigh Hunt, Hazlitt, or we speak of Boswell before all these people, is that they had a very sharp sense of history or historicity, I would say, in the sense that in his piece titled On Past and Present, which is the number 52 essay in the series on the hypochondriac, Boswell is contemplating about the nature of past and present, and he says, for instance, I'll quote, he says, as a great deal of man's happiness is in hope, a part of it is in recollection. And I have frequently experienced it as a kind of circumstance in our constitution that agreeable circumstances are remembered with still more pleasure than they originally afforded, while disagreeable circumstances are softened in the memory. Now, it's very interesting that he's talking about memory, he's talking about the past, he's talking about the, he says a great deal of man's happiness is in hope, which is in the future, and a part of it is in recollection, which is in the past. So there he's trying to unite the past and the future in the present. But there is a sense of humanism in the fact that he says that while we tend to soften all that was criminal or detestable in history, we soften it and it becomes likable. We must not forget that the past was still really not worth our effort, and the present is definitely better than the past. So it's not like
message of hope.
Yeah, in the sense that he says that the past was orthodox. We have come a long way. We have civilized. We've attained a kind of a cultural identity, and he says that we are in a better place. So he's contesting all these people who wallow in the past, or who think that past is always beautiful, or ancient refers to beauty, and ancient in itself prioritizes the past. He says that there is a kind of a mystery regarding this, and he says while he underscores the spontaneous response of human beings, that is they are inevitably optimistic and idealistic and all of that, but he says that there is something in distance, and this is a quote from his essay, there is something in distance, whether of time or of place, that affects the imagination with I know not what mysterious feelings of preference, right? But he says that I don't know what that mysterious feeling of preference is, but there is something to do with distance, whether of time or place, that affects the imagination in a manner that we seem to like the distant past or the distant place. But he says that in actuality, the present offers us hope, because we have worked and labored as human beings, as a collectivity, to build what we have reached today. And again, he quotes from Macbeth and says that the old world was really, has been purged of the commonweal, that society has been purged over a period of time because we have civilized. So I think what he's trying to do here is to present a kind of a humanistic view of history also, in suggesting that a series of wars that occurred in the past were not things that we need to wallow and we need to eulogize. In fact, the present is something which is the labor or hard work of people. So I see humanism there. How do you respond?
Of course, that's the precise point that you have made also earlier. That you look at the past from that angle, that it had a role to play, and it was quite valuable in the earlier period. But now you can learn your own lessons, keeping in mind the requirements of the present. And maybe in the future, if you have to build something, then hope is required. And otherwise, you'll, as you use the word wallow very well, otherwise you will keep wallowing in the past, where the hope is not there. Right. The hope is there always, in the future. And then the future one has to build, with one's own efforts.
Right.
And he's doing that effort himself. He's learning his lessons. He is also very aware about the present, and then that awareness itself is very progressive in ideological terms.
Right. So it's not like he is just being. And if you notice, this essay, for instance, is very different from his previous essay, the one on hypochondria, where he was talking about feeling, and he was talking about gloom, he was talking about melancholy, and he was like, what is the way out? How do I get out of it? Maybe the religion might be the answer, and all of that. So it was a very personalized, anguished sort of an essay. But this one is completely different.
What is the title of the essay?
This is called On Past and Present.
Oh, yes, of course.
So on past and present, in this essay,
there's a sense of history.
There's a sense of history. He's talking like somebody who's, and the structure of the essay is that it begins on one note. It begins with acknowledging the spontaneous human tendencies to like the present, or to find happiness in memory, right, in recollection, as he says. But then he says that we should not be going back to it, because what we have built is a better world, right? The present has hope in it, not because it should be looking back in memory, but because of the efforts that people have made in the present to build a better place for themselves based on rules and laws, for instance, and he talks about, he says that the pleasure is a good thing, that you're going back to that pleasurable moment, but then he says it remains mysterious. He adds a layer of mystery there. He says, I cannot decipher why we are so, that there is some mysterious feeling that is there. But then when he rationalizes it, he says that rationally speaking, we are in a better place than before, and we have worked towards it, and we are more civilized. There are, he talks about prisoners, for instance. He talks about treatments, medical treatments, etc. So I just felt that these two essays didn't look like they were coming from the same writer, in fact, because the writer speaks as a very sorted, rational subject here, and there he is a more personal friend who probably is sharing one's thoughts and feelings.
The references to Macbeth, the references to Hamlet are there in this essay?
In the, yeah.
So
right,
Shakespeare from the earlier period comes to mind rather than the 18th century.
Yeah. So in this essay he refers to Macbeth. The previous essay he was referring to Hamlet.
Hamlet.
Right. So,
they belong to the latter phase of his writing.
Right. All these essays have been written between 1777 and 1783.
When did Dr. Johnson die?
1784. So it is with Samuel Johnson's death that Boswell decides to permanently come and live in London and just spend his time there and work on the life of Johnson with all his diary entries. And this is also the period when he starts. So he begins first by writing that journal which was his travelogue with Johnson, and then later on he decides to turn it into the life of
On a lighter
Johnson.
note, Dr. Johnson, suppose he kept alive, what do you think about this chela of him? Who was drifting and going into a different direction?
Yeah, so you see, Boswell was a practicing lawyer, as I said. So law was something that was his job. But then he was drawn to literature because of Samuel Johnson, I think, or he admired Johnson and therefore entered this space. But I think it is the overall mood of the time that people are interested in expressing their thoughts. For instance, he's also expressing his theological uncertainties, whether to go this way or that, whether religion is the answer or not, and there are no clear answers available. So I think there is more uncertainty in or exploration in Boswell than there was in Johnson. Johnson was in that sense clear-headed, and he knew what he was saying, and he almost believed entirely in what he was saying. But Boswell, on the other hand, shares the predicament of human tendencies and the mental processes, and is closer in way to, say, Mackenzie and Leigh Hunt and Hazlitt, in that sense, the essayists of the 19th century, who then take it up in a big way. But he is probably a joining thread between Samuel Johnson and Mackenzie in that sense, because he is talking about this, and I find this more interesting, this space where the writer is uncertain and the writer is more exploratory, and because the 18th century in that sense is too clear cut and has polished answers for everything. So I think for me, Boswell, Boswell's writing is it has been really very interesting, because there are a lot of insights without actual conclusions being offered on things.
What would be your kind of conclusion, which is open-handed, of course, the way you have talked about it, with a great deal of uncertainty plus certainty that is there in the future? How would you conclude yourself?
I think he was a person who was both a scholar and, for instance, a man about the town. He was both, because, he is London's night. He was also very interested in the nightlife of London. So he would use these night spots also and fictionalize them and disguise them and put them in the Hypochondriack, etc. So I think he was just an ordinary, he was not a literary icon, so he was a scholar and yet not the person. So I think he had an edge in that sense, because he was very close to the underbelly of London, which I don't think Johnson and others would have access to. He was very close to the underbelly of London, and he could bring that up in his discussions. So I think that way he is both a scholar and a man of the streets.
Well, friends, Dr. Bajaj has put us back into the 19th century ethos, starting from the 18th century, and that Boswell, according to her, has helped a lot in moving in that specific direction. So I hope you have learned a few things about Boswell, about his character, about his role, that were unknown to me at least, and would have been unknown to most of us. So, very nice, very important, very significant kind of contribution to our understanding, and we all of us have to be thankful to Dr. Bajaj for this. So, we come to the end of it, and I believe that these are going to be some of the last lectures in this series, and let's keep you posted about them whenever the occasion comes, whether we shift to another dimension of literature and when. Thank you.